Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. So today we'll be picking up where we last left off. And I don't believe we have too much left of this particular chapter. Yeah, we're pretty close to finishing it, so it should be finished in this episode. That said, let's go ahead and hop into this. On February the 10th, the Wall Street Journal published a lengthy editorial headed "The Media's War," in which it noted that the public's perceptions are badly confused on the war in El Salvador and attributed much of that confusion to the way the struggle is being covered by the U.S. press. In a broad argument, the editorial followed closely the administration's line on violence in El Salvador. Extremists on the right and left do most of their murder in the dark of the night. Some of both factions are soldiers, but both have also learned long ago the trick of dressing in military uniforms to confuse their victims. Most notable, though, were several paragraphs that took up the question of El Mozote. Take the recent controversy over charges of a massacre by the elite battalion of the El Salvadoran Army. On January the 27th, Raymond Bonner of the New York Times and Alma Guillermo Prieto of the Washington Post simultaneously reported on a visit to rebel territory, repeating interviews in which they were told that hundreds of civilians were killed in the village of Mozote in December. Thomas O. Enders, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, later cast doubt on the reports. There had been a military operation, but no systematic killing of civilians, he said. And anyway, the population of the village was only 300 before the attack, in which 926 people supposedly died. When a correspondent is offered a chance to tour rebel territory, he certainly ought to accept and to report what he sees and hears. But there is such a thing as being overly credulous. Mr. Bonner reported, "It is clear the massacre happened," while Miss Guillermo Prieto took pains to say the reporters had been taken to tour the site by guerrillas with the purpose of showing their control and providing evidence of the massacre. In other words, whatever the mixture of truth or fabrication, this was a propaganda exercise. Realistically, neither the press nor the State Department has the power to establish what happened at Mozote in December, and we're sure the sophisticated editors of the Times recognize as much. Yet, as an institution, their paper has closed ranks behind a reporter out on a limb, waging a little campaign to bolster his position by impugning his critics. A news analysis charged the government of showing confusion by questioning press reports without presenting detailed evidence to support his position. The analysis posed the question of how American diplomats gather information abroad, but not the same question about American reporters. oddly missing from these paragraphs and from the rest of that very long editorial was any acknowledgement that the two reporters had actually seen corpses. In Guillermo Prieto's case, at least dozens of corpses, and that Meselas had taken photographs of those corpses. Instead, the editorial said that two journalists repeat interviews in which they were told that hundreds of civilians were killed in the village of Mozote, and then said immediately afterward that Enders later cast doubt on the reports, as if Enders or his representatives had actually made it to the village, as if the kind of evidence he was purveying were no different than what, after all, two eyewitness accounts, if not the events themselves, taken of their aftermath. The reporting done by the journalist and by the embassy officials is repeatedly yoked together as if the two parties had visited the same sites, seen the same evidence, talked to the same people, and merely drawn different conclusions. Neither party, the editorial declared, has the power to establish conclusively what happened at Mozote. The implication being, as the administration itself had argued repeatedly in its defense of its Salvadoran allies, that since there was no conclusive account, nothing can be truly known. The idea that much of a journalist's business consists of a studied sifting of what is said and what is observed, of a careful wrestling with graduations of evidence, and a continual judgment of the credibility of witnesses. This notion is nowhere present in the 16 paragraphs of the journal's editorial. 7 days after the journal's attack on the Times, overly credulous reporter, the State Department received a cable over the name of the ambassador to Honduras, John Negroponte, reporting on a visit by an embassy official and a Foreign House Affairs Committee staff member to the refugee camp at Colomoncagua, to which many of the refugees from Morazan had fled 2 months before. According to the cable, the refugees described to the American diplomat a military sweep in Morazan, December 7th to 17th, which they claim resulted in large numbers of civilian casualties and physical destruction, leading to their exodus. The cable went on to say that names of villages cited coincide with New York Times article of January 28th, same subject. The reporting officer added that the refugees' decision to flee at this time was when in the past they had remained during sweeps, lends credibility to reportedly greater magnitude of and intensity of military operations in northern Morazan. This information was not made public. By now, Bonner and his credulity had become a manner cause celeb in the press and on television talk shows. George Mellowin of the Journal, who had co-written the editorial, declared flatly that a televised discussion that obviously Ray Bonner has a political orientation in his coverage, extending the parallel already implied in the editorial with the Times' former correspondent in Cuba, Herbert Matthews, who the journal said in his glorification of Fidel Castro in the 1950s became a permanent embarrassment to the New York Times. Accuracy in Media, the right-wing newsletter, made this implication explicit in a number devoted solely to Bonner, accusing the reporter of carrying on a propaganda war during the Marxist guerrillas, or favoring the Marxist guerrillas in El Salvador. 6 months after the journal's attack on him, Raymond Bonner was gone from Central America. Since the El Mozote story and the controversies surrounding it, Bonner has been under great pressure during a steady fusillade of criticism from the embassy and the State Department, as well as from various right-wing American publications for whom Bonner had come to symbolize the supposed leftward tilt of reporting in Central America. In August of 1982, Bonner received a telephone call in this Managua hotel room informing him that he should report to the Metro desk in New York. The Times' decision to remove a correspondent who had been the focus of an aggressive campaign of administration criticism no doubt had a significant effect on reporting from El Salvador. The New York Times editors appeared to have caved to government pressure, and the administration seemed to have succeeded in its campaign to have a troublesome reporter, the most dogged and influential in El Salvador, pulled off the beat. The public position of A.M. Rosenthal, then the executive editor in the Times, has always been, as he told me by telephone, that at no time did anybody in the United States government suggest to me, directly or indirectly, that I remove Mr. Bonner, and further, that anyone who would approach the New York Times and suggest to me that I remove or punish a correspondent would have to be an idiot. To imply that a man who devoted himself to journalism would remove a reporter because of a U.S. government or the CIA or whatever is ridiculous, naive, cruel, and slanderous. According to Rosenthal, Bonner was removed because he had never been fully trained in the Times' particular methods. Bonner, he said, didn't know the techniques of weaving his story together. I brought him back because it seemed terribly unfair to leave him there without training. Bonner had been trained as a lawyer, had been an assistant district attorney and a Nader's raider, and had joined the Times as a stringer in Central America. Seymour Topping, then the managing editor, told me that because we were considerably pressed at the time in getting people into the field in Salvador, we short-circuited what would be our normal process of training people on Metro to learn the style and methods of the Times. Bonner, Topping went on, had done a first-class job of investigative journalism, and there was never any question that he had come up with the facts, that his stories were true. But if he had been more experienced, the way he had written his stories, qualified them, etc., would have left him much less open to criticism. But training was not the only issue. For that matter, as Bonner pointed out to me, he had spent a good part of 1981 on the Metro desk, and at least in Rosenthal's case, the question of Bonner's journalistic technique seemed to have been inextricably bound up with what the executive editor came to perceive as the reporter's left-wing sympathies. If anybody ever asked me to withdraw him, he'd still be there, Rosenthal told me, and certainly the idea of the government simply pressured the Times into withdrawing Bonner is wrong. Rosenthal suggests that others have promoted this version of the story because I was an agent of change in the Times and a lot of people didn't like my politics. But conversations with a number of Times reporters and editors, former and current, persuaded me that the campaign against Bonner was more effective than it might have been because of Rosenthal's own politics. Several people told me that Rosenthal had made no secret that he was unhappy with Bonner because the reporter, as one characterized the editor's view, was too willing to accept the communist side of the story. He was very vocal that Bonner was sympathetic to the communist side in Central America. The criticism from the right, led by the Wall Street Journal editorial on El Mozote, resonated with Abe because it reinforced his own suspicions about Bonner. There seemed to be a growing audience out there that agreed with Abe. Several current and former Times employees, none of whom would speak for attribution, pointed to a scene in the Georgetown restaurant. It was the evening of the annual Gridiron Dinner, in which Rosenthal criticized Bonner and angrily described the sufferings that communist regimes inflict on their people. Bonner returned to New York and the Metro desk after taking a leave of absence to write a book. He finally left the Times in 1984. But yeah, that ends that particular chapter. So we see there's even disagreement among members of the New York Times over how the story should have been approached, should have been reported. So yeah. And you can see that the government tries to push its own narrative of what happened. And again, we have the left versus right political stupidity of America. He's too right-wing. He's too left-wing. You know, again, this was during the Cold War, early 1980s. We're not even talking about, you know, more modern politics. We're looking at the 80s. So this left versus right stupidity has been going on for a long time, if you thought it hasn't. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.